She was 16 and kicked out. No warning, no second chance, just a trash bag of clothes on the front step and a locked door behind her. And with the only dollar she had left in her pocket, she bought an abandoned circus train car rusting on a forgotten siding outside a small town in eastern Ohio. The wheels had seized into the tracks. The roof had caved in on one end. The county assessor who sold it to her said she'd be lucky if it didn't collapse around her the first winter. But what nobody knew was that behind the rotted stage curtain, still hanging inside that train car, sealed in a place that hadn't been touched in almost 50 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Ruby Calloway had grown up in a house where love came with conditions. She was born in a small town called Marion Falls, the middle child of 3, the only one her stepfather Dale has seemed to look at like a problem to be managed, rather than a daughter to be raised. Her mother, a tired woman named Colleen, who worked double shifts at a diner off Route 9, loved Ruby in the quiet, exhausted way of someone who had nothing left over at the end of the day to spend on anyone, including herself. Dale had come into their lives when Ruby was 7, and from the beginning, there had been a line drawn somewhere Ruby could feel but never see, a line that put her a half step outside the family in a way her to have siblings never were. Ruby found circus posters the way other kids find baseball cards. Her grandmother on her father's side, a woman named Adeline, who died before Ruby turned 6, had traveled 42 seasons with a small circus back in the 1960s, working as a seamstress for the performers, and she'd left behind a shoebox of faded photographs that Ruby's mother kept in the hall closet. Elephants under canvas tents, women in sequined costumes suspended from ropes, a ringmaster in a red coat with tails, mid-bow, caught forever in black and white. Ruby used to take the box down when no one was looking and study every photograph like it was a message meant only for her. By the time Ruby was 12, Dale had stopped pretending. He wasn't cruel in any way the county would have written down. He didn't raise a hand to her. He simply erased her, a little more each year, the way water erases a name written in sand. He forgot her school events. He called her by her half-sister's name at dinner and didn't correct himself. He signed permission slips for his own children and left Ruby's on the counter until they expired. Colleen saw some of it and said nothing, because saying something had never once changed anything in that house, and after enough years, she had stopped believing it might. Ruby got a job at 14 sweeping up after hours at a small antique shop 2 towns over, run by an old man named Herschel, who had spent 30 years buying up estate sales and county auctions, filling his shop with the leftover pieces of other people's lives. Herschel took a liking to Ruby the way some old men take a liking to quiet, watchful kids who ask good questions. He taught her to spot real silver from plate, to read a maker's mark stamped into the base of a lamp, to tell a genuine antique from a clever reproduction by the weight of it in her hand, and the way the wood had aged from the inside out rather than been stained to look old. He taught her that everything with a history has a story stitched into it somewhere, if you're patient enough to go looking, and that most people walk past those stories every day without ever noticing they're there. Ruby saved almost every dollar Herschel paid her, tucking the bills into an old cigar box she kept hidden inside a loose floorboard under her bed, a hiding spot Dale had never found in 4 years, mostly because he had never once looked for it. By the time she was 16, she had $340, money she had been quietly saving toward nothing in particular. The way you save when you don't yet know what you're saving for, but some instinct tells you it will matter. The night everything ended, Ruby had come home 20 minutes past her curfew to closing up the shop for a Herschel, who'd asked her to stay late to help him catalogue a new estate lot. Dale was waiting in the doorway when she got there. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. He told her, in the flat, final voice of a man who had been waiting years for an excuse, that she was old enough now to figure out her own life, and that there wasn't room in his house for people who couldn't follow simple rules. Colleen stood behind him in the hallway and didn't say a word, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes on the floor. Ruby understood, in the space of about 4 seconds, that no one in that house was going to stop what was happening. She was allowed inside long enough to fill a trash bag with clothes. She took her cigar box. She took a single photograph of her grandmother Adeline in her seamstress apron, standing in front of a striped circus tent, laughing at something outside the frame. She did not take anything else, because there was nothing else in that house that had ever really belonged to her. She walked to Herschel's shop because it was the only place she could think to go, and she slept that first night on a cot in his back storage room, surrounded by grandfather clocks that had stopped keeping time decades ago and dressers that smelled like other people's closets. Herschel didn't ask many questions. He made her tea in the morning and told her, over to cups, about a piece of property he'd heard about at the county courthouse the week before, a forgotten rail siding on the edge of town where an old traveling circus had abandoned 3 train cars back in the 1970s when the company folded mid-season and simply never came back for its equipment. The county had been trying to get anyone, to take the cars off the tax rolls for years. The going rate, Herschel said, was $1 a car, just enough to make the transfer of ownership legal. Ruby went to the courthouse the next morning with her cigar box tucked under her arm, though she only needed a single dollar bill from it. The clerk, a heavy-set woman named Patrice, who had processed the same unclaimed circus property paperwork for years, without anyone ever actually taking her up on it, looked at Ruby for a long moment before sliding the deed across the counter. "You're sure about this?" Patrice said. It wasn't really a question. "I'm sure," Ruby said, and signed her name. Herschel drove her out to the siding that afternoon in his old delivery van. The rail spur ran along the edge of a stand of overgrown sumac trees at the far end of an industrial lot that hadn't been used for anything in decades, the tracks themselves gone orange with rust and have swallowed by weeds. 3 train cars sat where they had been left, sunk slightly into the earth on wheels that hadn't turned in 50 years. 2 of them were flatbed cars, their cargo long gone or stolen or rotted away. Nothing left but bare rusted decking. The third was different. It was a converted stock car, the kind that had once carried circus horses or big cats between towns. But somewhere along the way it had been fitted out as a performer's dressing and wardrobe car, with a narrow door cut into one side and 2 small barred windows near the roofline. The wood siding had gone grey and soft with rot in places, and a section of the roof at the far end had caved in, letting weather pour straight down into whatever was left inside. But the frame was steel underneath the wood, and the wheels, though seized, were still round, still whole. "That one," Ruby said, pointing at the stock car. "That's the one I want." Herschel raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. He helped her pry the narrow door open, its hinges shrieking after decades of rust, and the 2 of them stepped up into a space that smelled like mildew and old canvas, and, underneath it, something sweeter that Ruby couldn't place. Inside, the car was longer than it looked from outside, maybe 35 feet, lined on both sides with narrow built-in cabinets and a long shelf that had once held costumes and makeup cases. Most of the shelving had collapsed at the far end of the car, where the roof had failed. Rain had rotted through the floorboards, and daylight fell in a pale column onto a heap of ruined fabric that might once have been a costume trunk. But in the center of the car, still hanging from a rod that ran the width of the ceiling, was a curtain. It was heavy stage velvet, deep burgundy once, now faded to the color of dried blood in most places, hanging in stiff, dust-caked folds. It divided the car almost exactly in half, the way a dressing car would be divided to give performers privacy from each other while they changed. Ruby stood looking at it for a long moment before she reached out and pulled it aside. Behind the curtain was a narrow built-in vanity table with a cracked mirror still bolted to the wall above it, and beneath the vanity, tucked into a space that had clearly been built to be hidden, a wooden panel that didn't quite match the surrounding wood. Ruby knelt down and ran her fingers along its edge, and Herschel, standing behind her, said quietly that he'd seen enough hidden compartments in enough old furniture to top no one when he saw it. It took them almost 20 minutes to work the panel free without breaking it, using a flathead screwdriver Herschel kept in his van. When it finally gave way, it revealed a shallow compartment built into the wall of the car, no more than 18 inches deep, lined with what had once been velvet and was now little more than dust and thread. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow kept most of the damp out, was a leather satchel, cracked with age but intact, and beside it, a small wooden box with a brass clasp. Ruby lifted the satchel out first. It was heavier than its size suggested. She undid the buckle with hands that weren't entirely steady and folded back the flap. Inside were bundles of old currency, bills from the 1920s and 30s bound with disintegrating rubber bands, along with a smaller pouch that, when she opened it, revealed gold coins, the kind minted before Ruby had ever seen in a history book, packed tightly enough that they didn't shift when she tilted the pouch. She opened the wooden box next. Inside, resting on a bed of yellowed silk, was a collection of jewelry, a woman's pieces mostly, rings and brooches and a single strand of pearls, along with a folded photograph and a letter, the paper gone soft and fragile with age, written in a hand that slanted with the particular flourish of someone who had learned penmanship or another era entirely. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep telling stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever found something hidden in an old building that changed the way you saw it? Ruby unfolded the letter carefully, and Herschel leaned in to read over her shoulder as she read it aloud. My name is Odessa Vance. I was the wardrobe mistress for the Falkirk brothers traveling circus from 1919 until the company folded in the winter of 1971. This car was my home for over 50 years. I raised no children of my own, but I raised 3 generations of performers who passed through that curtain to become someone else for 2 hours a night before becoming themselves again. I saved what I could over the years, in gold when gold made sense, in currency when it didn't, because circus people never trust that the next season is guaranteed, and because I never had a bank account in my name in a town that would stay put long enough for me to open one. When the company folded, I was 78 years old, and too old to start again somewhere new. I left this car and everything in it, because I had nowhere else that felt like mine to take it to. If you are reading this, you found your way into a place most people walked past without a second look. That tells me you know how to look for things other people miss. I hope whatever you find here helps you become whoever you are meant to become, the way this curtain helped so many others become whoever they needed to be, if only for a little while. Odessa Vance, wardrobe mistress, Falkirk Brothers Circus. Ruby read the letter twice, sitting cross-legged on the rotted floorboards with dust motes turning slowly in the shaft of light from the broken roof. And she thought about her grandmother Adeline, a seamstress who had travelled with a circus not so different from this one, and about the shoebox of photographs in the hall closet of a house that wasn't hers anymore. And she understood, in a way she hadn't quite let herself feel yet, that she had walked toward this place without knowing why. The same way her grandmother must have once walked toward a striped tent on a dusty afternoon and never quite left. Coin dealer that Herschel brought out from the county seat spent an entire afternoon appraising the gold and the currency, and when the total was finally added up, accounting for both face value and collector value on the older bills, it came to $61,700. The jewelry, appraised separately by a woman who specialized in antique pieces, added another $8,400. Herschel helped Ruby open a bank account the following week, since she was still a minor and needed an adult co-signer, and he didn't hesitate for a second when she asked. The bank manager, a careful man who read Odessa Vance's letter from start to finish before saying a word, looked up at Ruby and told her that in 30 years of banking in that county, he had never once seen anything like it, and that whoever Odessa Vance had been, She would have been glad to know her letter finally found the person it was meant for. Ruby used part of the money to restore the train car properly, working through the following year with Herschel and a retired railcar mechanic named Pruitt, who had spent 40 years maintaining freight cars for a regional line before he retired and found himself, in his own words, bored out of his mind until Ruby showed up with a project worth caring about. They rebuilt the collapsed section of roof first, replacing rotted framing with pressure-treated lumber and sealing it properly against weather. Pruitt taught Ruby to free the seized wheel trucks, soaking the axles in penetrating oil 4 weeks before they'd turn again. Though the car would never run on rails anywhere again, it would simply sit, restored and dry and solid, on a small parcel of land Ruby bought at the edge of town with another piece of the money. A quiet lot with an old sycamore tree and enough room for a garden. She rebuilt the interior herself, sanding the built-in cabinetry back to bare wood, replacing what couldn't be saved with reclaimed lumber that matched the grain and color as closely as she could manage. She kept the curtain. She had it professionally cleaned and stabilized by a textile conservator towers away who specialized in antique fabric. And when it came back, the burgundy velvet had deepened back toward its original color, heavy and rich, and Ruby hung it exactly where she'd found it, dividing the car in the same place it always had been divided, because some things, she decided, deserved to stay exactly where they'd been left. She kept Odessa's letter and the empty leather satchel, her glass display case she built into the wall beneath the restored vanity, along with the photograph of her grandmother Adeline standing in front of a striped tent, laughing at something outside the frame. The two women, one she had known through a shoebox of photographs, and one she had come to know through a single letter, sitting together now in the place where all of it had started. The town noticed Ruby the way small towns notice anyone who takes something everybody had given up on and makes it whole again. Herschel had already told half his customers the story before Ruby had even finished the roof repairs, and people started stopping by the siding just to see the train car for themselves, standing at a respectful distance until Ruby waved them over and let them look inside. An old woman named Frances, who had watched the Falkirk Brothers Circus perform in that very town as a girl in the 1960s, came by one Sunday afternoon and stood in front of the restored curtain with tears in her eyes, telling Ruby that she remembered a wardrobe mistress with silver hair and a kind face who used to let the local children peek backstage as they promised to be quiet. Ruby got her GED the following spring, working with a tutor Herschel arranged and paid for without ever being asked, and she kept working at the antique shop, learning the trade properly now instead of just sweeping floors, cataloguing estate lots with the same careful attention Odessa Vance had once given to costumes that turned ordinary people into something extraordinary for 2 hours at a time. One evening in early autumn, a little more than a year, and she'd signed her name or a $1 deed at the county courthouse. Ruby sat on the small set of wooden steps she'd built at the train car's door and watched the sun go down behind the sycamore tree, its light falling gold and long across the restored siding, catching on the old rust that still marked the wheels she'd chosen not to repaint, because some scars, she'd decided, were worth keeping visible. She thought about Odessa Vance, a woman who had spent 50 years inside a single train car, making other people beautiful enough to be believed, who had saved quietly against a future she knew might never come, and who had still, in the end, trusted that someone would eventually walk through that narrow door and be worth leaving everything to. She thought about her grandmother Adeline, a seamstress she'd never really known except through a shoebox of photographs, and about her mother Colleen, still working double shifts at a diner off Route 9, still married to a man who had erased his stepdaughter a little more each year until there was nothing left of her in that house at all. She did not feel angry when she thought of Dale anymore. She felt, mostly, a kind of quiet distance, the way you feel about weather that has already passed. She understood, sitting on those steps with the light going gold and then blue around her, that she had been walking toward this curtain her whole life without knowing its name, The way she'd once studied a shoebox of circus photographs like they were a message meant only for her. The way she'd learned to spot a real thing from a clever imitation before she ever needed that skill for anything that mattered. She had been kicked out of one home to walk, almost by accident, into one that had been waiting 50 years for someone to open its door. That's the thing about the places our lives are pulled toward. We don't always know why we want what we want. We can't always explain the shape of our own longing, but the pull is real, and if you follow it far enough, past the doors that close on you and the people who stop looking at you like you matter, it usually leads you somewhere. For some people, that somewhere is a family they were born into. For others, it's a place they have to find on their own and rebuild with their own two hands. A lighthouse on a cliff, a houseboat on a bayou, a schoolhouse in the woods, a train car on a forgotten siding at the edge of a town that once let a circus pass through and never quite forgot it. The form doesn't matter. What matters is whether you can stand inside it, look around, and feel something settle in your chest that says, "This is the place. This is where I begin again." Ruby Calloway was 16 years old and kicked out of the only home she'd ever known. She had $1 to her name, and she spent it on an abandoned circus train car on a forgotten siding in Ohio. It was the best dollar she ever spent. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments, what's a door you walked through that turned out to be exactly where you were meant to be? We'd love to hear your story. See you in the next one.